All right, hopefully everyone, as you're coming in to the webcast tonight, you can see our home screen here with the Oregon Legislative Session graphic up, and I'm seeing participants join, and we'll wait just a few moments to make sure we get everyone that is joining tonight before we get started. So I'll probably chime in a few more times to make sure the silence doesn't confuse those that are joining a little bit later, but otherwise don't mistake our silence for us not being here. We're here. And as we continue to wait, I see that it looks like there's one participant, Bill O'Brien, with a hand raised. And Bill, if you could put whatever you have to I'm assuming a question, if you can put that in the Q&A, we'll be able to look at it there and get you a response. And for those who are trickling in, we'll wait just another moment here before we get started, but we'll get started really soon. And Bill, like I said, go ahead and use that Q&A if you need to. All right, everybody, I think we're going to get started. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a moment so that you can see bigger versions of me and my colleague. Actually, give me 1 second here. So I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us for this webcast on the 2021 Oregon Legislative Session. And the graphic that you just saw, I just got a text telling me we had one error on there. It's not Pacific Standard Time anymore, it's Pacific Daylight Time. And hopefully that'll be the case forevermore moving forward. But my name is Sean Stevens, and I'm the Executive Director for Oregon Wild. And tonight I'm joined by my colleague, Danielle Moser, our Wildlife Program Coordinator. And we're here to answer the question, what's going on in Salem? And we're going to be giving a presentation taking you through some of the political dynamics, the key bills, and other takeaways, as well as tapping things you can do to get involved. And we're going to run through a presentation, and after that, we're going to be doing some Q&A. And so we encourage you to use that Q&A tool when the time comes. You can answer your questions at any time, and we usually get a flood of questions at the end of the presentation. So actually, the sooner you get yours in, it'll allow us, as we sort of co-present here, to organize and eventually answer them. I do want you to know that if you haven't joined the webcast before, a recording of this program will be emailed out tomorrow and will be posted on our website, oregonwild.org, in the Wild blog section. And if you got a raffle ticket, thank you so much. Your support allows us to continue doing these presentations and the work that we do to protect Oregon. The raffle will be open through the evening. So if after the presentation you decide you'd like to enter, you can do that by finding this event on the oregonwild.org homepage and entering the raffle. Winners will be selected tomorrow and contacted by email to verify shipping address. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the indigenous people of this land we call Oregon. For me specifically, I'm video conferencing in from Portland, which is the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Kalapuya, Wasco, Molalla, Cowlitz, and Watwalit bands of the Chinook, and many other tribes who made and still make their homes near the confluence of the Columbia and Willamette rivers. One more thing before we get started. Next week, we'll be exploring old growth forests, not just the ones here in the Pacific Northwest that you're familiar with. We'll be joined by Joan Maloof, an author and activist who founded the Old Growth Network in order to safeguard ancient forests across the country, from the redwoods of California and Southern Oregon to the cypress groves of Florida. And there's much to learn about these incredible landscapes. So you can sign up for that now at OregonWild.org. All right, so we're gonna get started here. I'm gonna share my screen and get that presentation back up. Give me 1 second. All right. Danielle, can you give me confirmation that you can see that?
I can.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're here today to talk about Oregon's legislative session. And every year, Oregon's legislature has a legislative session, but in the odd years, it's a longer session, 5 months long, this year starting in January and ending in June. You can see I put the calendar up, and it's got some of the important dates. In fact, an important date is, one of them is this week, where bills have to be scheduled in committee for a work session, and that's when the committee members actually vote on the bills. By the end of the week, they have to be scheduled, or else they can't move forward in that committee anymore, and in the House of, or the chamber rather, in the Senate or the House of Origin. This year, in a long session, in typical long sessions, there are almost 1,000 bills introduced in the Senate, and there are over 1,500 bills introduced in the House. So many of these will not see the light of day, but the workload of the legislature is pretty immense. And so catching their attention on a particular issue can be tricky. Of course, this year is also unique in that we have some challenges and opportunities posed by the fact that we are still in the middle of the pandemic, and the session is being conducted right now, at least for the members of the public, entirely remotely. Only House representatives and senators and their staff are allowed in the building right now. But you can see, this was me in the top right of your screen testifying before the House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee earlier this month. Now, I mentioned challenges and opportunities because I think we're all pretty familiar with the challenges that are posed right now by this remote environment. If you haven't seen, this is a real event that happened, an attorney in front of a judge accidentally using a filter that made him look like a cat. I think the quote was, "I am actually not a cat, I am a real person." So there are some challenges and the technical glitches have been present, but of course the opportunities posed by a remote environment are there as well. Our colleague Rob Clavins, who lives in Enterprise, does not have to make the 6-hour and 8-minute drive to the Capitol if he wants to testify on a bill. And so in some ways it's more inclusive for participation by the broad public because you just have to sit on your couch, pop open your computer and testify. And we'll talk a little bit later about how everyone can engage in the process because it is so easy this year in the remote environment. Of course, also, the more things change with the remote session, the more they stay the same. We have already seen a Republican walkout this session, which makes it, as this Oregonian article highlights, the 3rd straight year that Republicans have halted legislative work. Of course, most damningly last year when they essentially canceled the entirety of the short session. And before that, the end of the regular session in 2019 that doomed many important bills, but including climate action. And so we've seen sort of a rinse and repeat of this tactic. Interestingly, folks are starting to pay attention to this and trying to think about solutions for how we can make sure that elected officials who are elected by voters to do a job actually show up to do that job. And there's some polling out just this week that highlights how much Oregonians across the political spectrum really do expect legislators to show up and legislate, even if they are in the minority party. They can't be a voice for their constituents if they're not in the building, debating bills, putting forward bills, and participating in the legislative process. So we're going to walk through topic by topic here and sort of trade off back and forth between myself and Danielle. And these are the areas that Oregon Wild works in when we're down in the building, as folks say about Salem in the Capitol. Of course, this year we're virtually in our computers in the building. But Oregon Wild works all across the state to protect wildlands, wildlife, and waters. And some of that work takes us to the halls of power in Salem, where state agencies and the legislature have a lot of influence, obviously, over how laws and rules are created that either protect or put at risk forest values, wildlife, waters, special places. And so we're going to run through topic by topic. And then again, remember that we're really happy to answer questions at the end. If you put them in the Q&A, we'll be able to get to those at the end. But I'm going to start here with forests. And typically throughout our history, Oregon Wild was really focused on public lands, on national forests and BLM lands. And of course, if you followed Oregon Wild over the last decade, we've been much more engaged at the state level with state forest management, and half of the forested landscape in the state that is owned by private landowners, many of them large industrial private landowners. And we have been working to advance protections on those landscapes for endangered species, clean drinking water for communities, public health as it relates to aerial spraying of toxic pesticides on industrial forest lands. And we had a big breakthrough last year in that work, and I'm involved in some negotiations now to negotiate with the timber industry over a whole set of changes to the Oregon Forest Practices Act, the rules and laws that govern forest practices in Oregon. But while we're working on that, there's also some key things that we're working on in Salem that are related to forests, but a little bit different than the Forest Practices Act. And one of the key ones is the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. And you're probably familiar with this entity, even if you don't know it by name, because you've been subject to their advertising, either underwriting on OPB, the TV ads that they run. I'm a big Portland Timbers fan, and in the first season that the Timbers were in MLS, OFRI was there promoting the logging industry in the stadium as a sponsor of the Timbers. So OFRI really has flown under the radar. Most people don't know who they are until this last year, when an investigative reporting team from OPB, the Oregonian, and ProPublica really dug into their practices and found some very alarming things. We've always had a hard time with OFRI because they essentially use tax dollars to put out propaganda for the logging industry with the states in perimeter. It looks like a state agency is telling you these great things about our forest rules. But it turns out that they were doing a lot more than that, including illegally lobbying. They're not allowed to lobby, and they were working behind the scenes to try to influence legislation. They've tried to suppress science and academic freedom at Oregon State University, especially around forest and climate science that's been coming out there, that is some of the best researchers in the world in this field saying things that the logging industry doesn't like, and they've tried to squelch that science behind the scenes. And so we have put forward, along with allies at the Oregon Conservation Network, OLCV, the Wild Salmon Center, and others, a bill that would eliminate OFRI and take the $4 million a year that they get in tax money and put it towards better uses, including some holes at the Oregon Department of Forestry in their science support that would allow them to be a little bit more on the cutting edge of climate smart forestry and water protection and other issues. And so I've been working on this bill a lot, and it had a hearing earlier this month, and actually just 2 hours ago, it was posted for a work session. So remember that deadline I told you about, that this Friday things have to be posted for a work session? Well, luckily this bill was, which means it still can move forward. And so next week it'll have a work session, hopefully, if the calendar holds. And we're looking to move this out of the House committee that it's in and onto the House floor and then over to the Senate. A lot of momentum around this bill. Again, a lot of that because of the reporting and just the spotlight that's been shown on OFRI and their actions. Next up, this is actually something that Oregon Wild has talked about a lot in the past. We're not the primary folks working on this bill, but it's really important. House Bill 2379 is aimed at reinstating a timber severance tax. And the severance tax is something that was around over a couple of decades ago, but was eliminated in favor of just a harvest tax for the timber industry. And there's a lot of details there. Again, it's the same reporting team that really shone a bright spotlight on this and how it's harmed rural communities from not having the resources that they once had to support everything from schools to roads to you name it that local governments need to fund. But the short version is that Oregon has missed out on something like $50 to $60 million a year from the timber industry that they have not been taxed over the last few decades. And you look to our neighbors and their approach to taxation, and we actually produce more logs, more timber than Washington. And yet we're bringing in something like a third of the tax revenue from forest activities. And so this is really about timber tax fairness and supporting rural communities. And it actually just yesterday passed out of committee in that same House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee. And it will move on to the Revenue Committee for consideration there before it potentially goes before the full House. It was a close vote, and they did something of voting it out called without recommendation. And that essentially means that they're not telling future legislators that are going to consider it, we're giving this the thumbs up. It's more of a, we want to move this out for more consideration, but we're not sure if you should vote yes on it. So we'll see where that one goes. I think there's more conversation to be had, but it's good to see it getting the conversation in Salem that it has this session. And I've got one more on forests before I pass it off to Danielle. And this is actually, you know, everything's happening right now. It's a busy time in Salem because this bill was heard in committee today in the Senate Natural Resources and Wildfire Recovery Committee. And the chair of that committee, Senator Golden from down in Ashland, this is his bill that he's worked on, SB 335. And it's really about creating better governance structures at the Oregon Department of Forestry. Right now, the Board of Forestry that oversees the rules in Oregon, it's a 7-member board. 3 of them can have a direct financial conflict of interest. They can be essentially regulating themselves. And Senator Golden doesn't think that's fair. He wants to reduce that conflict of interest. And he also wants to take away their power to hire and fire the state forester, who is essentially the head of the Department of Forestry, and put that power with the governor. And the rationale here is that forests are so important to this state for so many different reasons that to not have the governor, who's an elected official statewide, be able to determine who is running the agency in charge of forests is missing the accountability from the voters for what they might want from from forest rather. And by having the governor in charge, you're going to get more direct response to what the people of Oregon actually want their forests to be managed for than you do currently with the Board of Forestry hiring and firing the state forester. All right. So, like I said, questions at the end, and I'm sure you'll have them, but I'm going to pass it off to Danielle now for wildlife.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Danielle Moser. I'm the Wildlife Program Coordinator for Oregon Wild, and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm going to talk through about 4 wildlife bills that are as well moving this week and lots going on. I just want to point out that this is not an exhaustive list. There's definitely a lot more happening on wildlife that we're supporting or trying to stop, but obviously with limited time, I just wanted to touch on at least 4 that are sort of top priorities, both for Oregon Wild and the Oregon Wildlife Coalition, which we're part of. So yeah, let's go to the next slide, Sean. So House Bill 2728, this is a bill to end coyote killing contests in Oregon. So if you've been on our email list or following really any one of our Oregon Wild's emails along with coalition partners, you've probably seen this one come up before. This will be the 3rd attempt to try to pass a bill to end coyote killing contests. And for those who don't know, these are essentially contests that happen a few times a year, usually in December, January timeframe. And basically it's who can kill the most, the biggest, or even the smallest number of coyotes in a certain time period. There's often cash prizes or guns or other things given away for the winners. And it's cruel, it's gruesome. And we work with a lot of hunters who also say it's just unethical hunting. And really, there's not a good purpose for it. There's been people who've been trying to like give it a justification, like, oh, we need it ahead of calving season for ranching, but all science points to that this actually exacerbates the problem around coyotes and livestock conflict. So it's been something that we've supported. The Humane Society has really been the lead organization on this, but this is the third attempt to try to get this through the legislature. Sean pointed out the three walkouts from the Republicans, and this was definitely swept up in the first one, especially in 2019. And they really tried to use this as a blame and this urban-rural divide, and just that framing as a reason for their walkout, and tried to place blame on this bill, even though the bill had been moving far in advance of the walkout. So there's even Republican co-sponsors on this bill. It's had a work session already in the House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee, and tomorrow at 3:15 is, it had a public hearing already, and tomorrow is the work session, which means this is going to be the vote in the committee. So fingers crossed, we will see how it goes, but you have an opportunity still to call your state representative, especially if they're on the committee, show your support for House Bill 2728. And you even have until March 19th at 3:15, so with 24 hours after the hearing, to submit written testimony. So Sean and I will actually walk through with you all how to do that and where you can find the spot for submitting testimony to the various committees. But just make a note that you can still submit testimony up until Friday at 3:15. Next. Protecting beavers on private land, House Bill 2844. This is a really important one. And I want to, well, first I want to talk a little bit about benefit of beavers if we're not all on the same page about that. But then I want to make a distinction about this bill, because there's a delineation between beaver on private land and beaver on public land. And I just want us all to be on that same page. But first and foremost, I mean, the state animal for Oregon, beavers are a vital component for Oregon's ecological health, our community resilience. There's just so many benefits of beaver on the landscape, including increased wildfire resilience because of their ability to create natural fire breaks, the increased water security through the creation of ponds and wetlands, and the ability to filter water and sediment to improve drinking water quality and stream temperatures. And also they help provide rearing habitat for many salmonid species, especially those that are imperiled. So beavers there's just so many benefits to that species as a keystone species. But as it relates on private land, they are considered a predatory species. And a predatory species, the reason they're listed that way is because they are part of the rodent family, and therefore rodents are all classified as predatory. On public land, beaver are considered fur bearers, but on private land, and being that it has this classification of predatory, it essentially means there are no trap check requirements, there are no permits required to kill a beaver. You can do anything if you're a landowner when it comes to beaver, and that's really a very big challenge for us who have been advocating for their recovery. And so one of the things that this would do, this bill, House Bill 2844, is it would remove that predatory animal status for beaver on private land, which would move authority for beavers from the Department of Agriculture over to the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which is the actual, Fish and Wildlife managing agency. It would encourage non-lethal usage before simply setting up a trap and killing beaver. And it would really give the agency an ability to get a full picture of what's going on with beaver in the state. One of the issues we have over and over again with them is, since there's no data collection on beaver that are trapped and killed on private land, or if there is, it's just very spotty, it's tough to really know what we need to be doing in way of beaver recovery, because you have just this big gap in analysis. So this is just getting us in the right direction of understanding what's happening with beaver on private land. I do want to note, this doesn't mean that people still couldn't trap beaver, especially if there is actual infrastructure damage. It just means there needs to be a permit. And it also means that if now that they're a fur bearer, that there would be trap check requirements and other things related to that. So fingers crossed for this as well. It's an important bill that gets us in the right direction. And that also has a public hearing in the House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee tomorrow at 3:15. So we have quite a doozy of a day tomorrow at 3:15. And again, if you want to submit written testimony, you can do that up until March 19th at 3:15. Okay, next one, Sean. HB 2913, HB 2600, these all relate to reinstating funding for the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund. There's actually a third bill as well, which I need to remind myself the number. I apologize. I'll pull that up and share it with the group in the chat. But the OCRF was created in 2019 as a way to get ODFW back on track to actually serving its conservation mission. I'm sure if you've listened to us, you know that we have definitely a push-pull with the agency when it comes to them actually allocating enough resources and money and staff time to implementing their conservation strategy, focusing on non-game species, habitat, etc. So this was an attempt to, again, get us on the right path toward funding those programs. Anti-conservationists in the legislature, however, put a tight timeline on this funding. They only allowed it to be in existence for 2 years, and so until 2021. And in order to get $1 million from the general fund, it required $1 million match from private members of the public, entities, businesses, whomever. That's pretty unique to do it like that. But I do have to say, given all of that, the fact that last year, of course, we all got hit with COVID and trying to fundraise in that environment is challenging. I give the OCRF and their advisory committee a lot of credit because they've been able to do some really, really incredible community-based on-the-ground conservation, especially as it relates to sea otters, beavers, wolverine, a lot of equity in recreation packages and projects. So basically, these bills are trying to remove the sunset clause, as we say, and actually reinstate funding for another 2 years. The one bill, 2600, would actually allocate a small portion of the state transient lodging tax to the OCRF. This logic being that so many people are traveling to Oregon to see our natural beauty, experience and go wildlife viewing. So to actually allocate a portion of that money to protecting wildlife, fish, and its natural habitat. Don't know if that one will go through. I listened to the hearing yesterday. There was a bit of course, concern about that, but at the very least, we hope that the OCRF is reinstated for another 2 years. So like I said, they had a public hearing in the House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee yesterday, and we hope they get a work session soon, by Friday. Okay, last one. Oh, no, there we go. Okay. HB 3204, preventing zoonotic diseases. So this one's led mostly in part by our conservation partner, the Center for Biological Diversity, but it is one I wanted to touch on. Obviously very well timed given COVID-19 and just all of those challenges. So this really is trying to set up the state to be better prepared for a potential future pandemic and trying to obviously stop any pandemic from its origins being in Oregon. So as you probably know, zoonotic disease transmission is driven in part by wildlife exploitation, including trade and trafficking. The United States is one of the world's top importers of wildlife, consuming an estimated 20% of the global wildlife market. So these novel zoonotic pathogens pose a serious threat to our public health, as we obviously have seen, poses a huge threat to our biological diversity and economic stability. And I think you've all seen, but the costs of these wildlife diseases to public health are enormous and tend to fall disproportionately on Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, stemming from poor healthcare access and structural discrimination. So essentially what HB 3204 would do is help Oregon prevent, monitor, and respond. It just gets us better prepared and equipped to deal with a potential future zoonotic disease. One of the things I wanted to point out, it also directs the Department of Fish and Wildlife to establish a list of wildlife species that may not be imported, sold, or handled in the state due to the risk of zoonotic disease. It gives a framework and a whole response plan as well. So please check that bill out as well. That also had a work session, or excuse me, had a public hearing yesterday in the House Committee on General Government, which I have to say is new for us wildlife advocates. We're not often in that committee. And hopefully, oh, excuse me, and it has a work session scheduled on Tuesday, March 30th at 3:15. So you have time to show your support of that bill as well. That's what I got on wildlife.
Awesome. Thanks, Danielle. And I'm going to talk about wildfire now. Obviously, pretty important topic, especially considering last year's wildfire season. And as you might expect, this is wildfire is an issue that Oregon Wild cares about a lot, because a lot of the proposed solutions around wildfire tend to focus on the forest landscape, where sometimes fires start. And the solutions that some put forward around trying to treat the landscape to stop the fires, rather than treating the communities to make them safe for what are bound to be more fires given this era of climate change. So SB 248 is the legislature's version of an omnibus package around wildfire solutions. And this bill was actually heard earlier this week for the first time in committee after a lot of informational hearings from experts. And there are going to be more changes to it over time because it is such a big, complex piece of legislation. This bill existed in a similar form last year, was a casualty of the second Republican walkout in 2020, which is, sort of ironic if you're someone that wants to think of it that way, given what a bad fire season that we had in 2020, that we didn't have some of these solutions in place. There is a lot to like about this bill, in the way that it focuses on communities and community health. It talks about wildfire mapping so that we know where the risks are for wildfires, so we can prioritize landscapes that need support in terms of rezoning, so that we're not building out into places that are really fire prone, or places that need support for to do defensible space and home hardening work. Where are we going to prioritize resources as a state to make sure that people are keeping their communities safe and prepared for fire, knowing that it's going to come? Things like smoke shelters, so that when we do have days with bad smoke, that those that don't have good proper filtration in their homes or have to work outside, that they have somewhere to go to make sure that they're maintaining their respiratory health. Unfortunately, one of the things that's in here as well is this focus on trying to treat the forest to keep fires from happening, which the science really suggests is a dubious pursuit, because how much of the forest we would have to treat. We would essentially have to cut down a lot of the forest to prevent fire, because we don't know where fires are going to start any particular year. And what the research suggests is if we really focus on the community, the home, outward rather than the forest inward, we're going to get the best return on investment. And we're probably going to have fewer of the side effects that we might have from doing all that landscape treatment. So that's really the thing that Oregon Wild is advocating for around this bill, is trying to strengthen the provisions around community safety and make sure that the stuff that's being proposed out in the forest isn't coming at the expense of that community safety work that could be done. I think the one real important anecdote here is one of the largest fires from last year, the Almeda fire down in Jackson County. This was not a forest fire. It was started along I-5 and spread quickly through a low-income community south of in between Ashland and Medford. And it destroyed the most homes of any of the fires, and probably is going to have the largest economic damage of any of the fires. It wasn't a forest fire, and yet one of the primary things that we're talking about this session is, how do we stop forest fires from happening? Instead, invest in those communities, make sure those communities are fire safe, and we'll be doing right by the citizens of Oregon. Like I said, this had its first hearing this week. There's going to be a lot more conversation around this bill, because it is one of the big focus areas for the legislature this session. I'll kick it back to Danielle for climate change.
Great, thank you. That surprised me. I wasn't sure. I was like, wait, are there more? Great. Yep. So a couple to go over here. And yeah, obviously, if you have follow-up questions, do let us know. So HB 2021. Oh, sorry. Could you kick off the first slide, Sean? Just start talking. Thank you. HB 2021, 100% clean energy for all. Obviously, climate change is here. We need to be addressing it. There's no time to delay. This bill is obviously 100% clean energy, an attempt to really get us at 100% of our electricity sold in 2035 and each subsequent calendar year to come from clean electricity. And they define that as a non-emitting source. Obviously, there's some variation between what maybe some of us might call clean, but this essentially means no coal, oil, natural gas. In doing so, though, obviously, as we move to 100% clean energy economy, we want to make sure that communities are protected, that there's well-paying local jobs in the renewable energy sector. So this puts a huge emphasis on training, on community-based projects that really help bolster up communities and, again, provide good paying jobs. So it's kind of that in tandem. This is also an Oregon Conservation Network priority, which I think Sean mentioned. Oregon Wild is a member of OCN. It's a big network of lots of different conservation organizations, and they choose different priorities, and this is one of them for the 2021 session. So at this point, and Sean, I don't know if you saw an update to this. Last time I checked, it was still awaiting a public hearing and work session in the House Energy and Environment Committee. So I don't know if you saw a different update, but that's the last I've heard on that one.
Yeah, I think this week it has amended language and is at least getting an introductory public hearing from just an informational perspective, which is usually the precursor to the public hearing and the work session.
Great. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. HB 2475, the energy affordability bill. So obviously, as we transition to 100% clean energy, we have to make sure that this is affordable for people. It's no surprise, especially after last year, that people are, lots of communities, lots of families are struggling to, feed their families. And so we want to make sure that as we transition into this clean energy economy, that we're protecting the most vulnerable. So HB 2475 would provide more authority to the Public Utilities Commission to provide rate designs such as discounts that protect low-income customers, as well as providing more resources for these community-based environmental justice advocates. So essentially, the Public Utility Commission obviously decides the rates, passes it on to consumers, but as of right now, they don't have a ton of flexibility about creating a different design and discount structure for low-income communities. So this would give them that authority, and it would also make sure that environmental justice advocates and low-income community advocates have a seat at the table. This just passed the State House of Representatives yesterday, I believe, and I saw this quote from Representative Marsh that I thought was pretty great. She says, "Big utilities can hire the best lawyers to argue their case. We want to make sure that Oregonians who suffer the greatest energy burden get a fair chance to have their interests heard." So I think that's a good summary of what this is doing, and just making sure that, again, they're engaged in the Public Utility Commission process. Okay, next one. And the final one I have on climate is HB 2488, addressing equity and climate in land use. So this comes out actually as a result of the governor's executive order on climate, in which she's charging state agencies with the responsibility of reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the state and promoting carbon sequestration in our natural and working lands. So every state agency has been charged, or at least they should have been charged, with forward momentum to look at climate change, incorporate it into their goals, and really develop a strategy. I actually can say the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is the only agency, a fish and wildlife agency in the country that has a plan in place. So thank you, Governor Brown, I guess, for that. But this one is focused on the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD. And again, it just make sure that land use planning goals address climate change, reduce emissions, and of course, promote the participation of historically marginalized and underserved communities. For example, if this bill passed, it would identify and map anticipated impacts to public resources and local communities from climate change. It would also identify, quantify, and map health risks to disadvantaged communities caused by land uses, and much more. So this is really about protecting vulnerable communities and making sure that we're doing everything we can at every state agency level to address climate change and reduce emissions. And that's what I got. Thanks, Sean. Oh, this is me again. That's right. So every legislative session, there's legislation that gets introduced that you think, what is this about? and it just boggles the mind. There was one, what was that, 3 years ago, where a state legislator essentially wanted a bunch of red tape anytime that ODFW was even contemplating a relocation or a translocation of a wildlife species or a population. And this literally stemmed from his conspiracy theory that Oregon Wild picked up OR7, the famous wolf out of Northeast Oregon, and drove it across the state and delivered it to Southern Oregon. We kid you not. I actually listened to that testimony and went, oh my gosh, she's actually calling on this as the example for introducing this bill. So the point is, every year there are things that boggle the mind. And so we wanted to wrap this up before we get into Q&A, just point out a few that are both alarming and also a little like, did you really think about that? So yeah, first one is HB 2803. And I put in my own notes, all things David Brock Smith. This is a legislator from the South Coast who definitely has put out his fair share of anti-conservation things, but this one I think tops the list. And I quote, "This requires the State Department of Fish and Wildlife to operate a program in Southwest Oregon to control populations of species that prey on salmon." So obviously control is a euphemism for lethal control, aka killing animals that prey on salmon. And I have to say, I think when some of us saw this, we went, did he think about this? Because humans are a species. And so everybody I've talked to in the legislature that also kind of looked at this bill and said, what the heck? Technically humans would qualify under this bill. So I guess he really is taking this to the next level of anything that preys on salmon, you've got to go. But in reality, we see this a lot when it comes to protecting salmon, which we obviously strongly support. But what happens often is this is an attempt to scapegoat other species and focus on them as the reason for salmon decline, instead of actually focusing on the root issues causing salmon decline in Oregon: habitat loss, logging, dams, climate change. So he's obviously attempting to kill all the cormorants, kill all the sea lions, I don't know, but the joke here is it looks like it also includes humans. He also has a bill, HB 2771, which essentially removes the governor's authority to designate marine sanctuaries. Now, what's interesting to me about this is he's very worried about salmon, but now he's actually trying to get rid of marine sanctuaries. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to open it up so that there can be more lethal control of other species that prey on salmon. Be it as it may, the fact is he wants, in order for any marine sanctuary to go through, it needs the legislature's approval, not just the governor to certify the Secretary of Commerce's designation. So again, another one that we think, oh my gosh, why are you spending time trying to remove conservation measures that are incredibly vital at this time? The other one we have here is SB 643, which exempts counties from the prohibition on hunting cougars with dogs. This is one that boggles the mind because Measure 18, which passed in 1994 and was voted on by an overwhelmingly majority of Oregonians, said we are going to ban the use of hounds in hunting cougars and bears. And every year something like this comes up where the counties are trying to get exempted from this. And it's, again, just going against the will of the people who have voted on this and said assuredly we don't want to use hounds to hunt cougar and bear. So that, of course, makes its rears its ugly head yet again. And then finally, as Sean's been talking about, there's a bill on post-fire logging, SB 675, which, wildfire is obviously top of mind for a lot of people. What we often see, of course, is logging companies pushing for post-fire salvage logging. Often, and I think, Sean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because they feel like we need to clean the environment. You got to clean up all that mess so that things can grow. And the fact here is that fire has obviously been part of the natural cycle for millennia, and another bill to just get it logging is not what we need. So not surprising, but unfortunate. So there we are in the upside down.
Thanks, Danielle. I'm gonna put it on this slide, but maybe before we talk about what's on here, I think it's a good time to jump in and make sure we get at some questions. There's a few in here, and if you have something that you're thinking of now, please pop it into the Q&A box and we'll address it, because we'll have time for a few more than what we've got here. So one question that we have is to talk about the big Biden bill and how it may affect Oregon's wild. And I'm assuming that the big Biden bill is the coronavirus relief act that passed this past week. And I can try to touch on that a little bit. I think that the primary way that I see the stimulus bill impacting Oregon in terms of species and wildlands is that we're not going to have to see agency budget cuts in quite the same way that we might have if there hadn't have been relief for local governments, state governments. And we were looking at some across the board cuts of, I think, something like 7%, given the downturn and what it did to Oregon's revenues. And now, instead, I think we're going to see agencies like the Department of Fish and Wildlife able to hold on to positions and maybe even have room to add some things because there's not going to be this budget crunch. I think that's the primary way. Obviously, there's a lot more on the agenda for Biden, including pursuing 30% by 2030 of protected landscapes for wildlife and conservation. They have a real climate focus, and we're pushing for some action on forests and climate to make sure that we're protecting mature and old growth forests across the Pacific Northwest that are huge storehouses for carbon. So there's other opportunities with Biden, but I think in terms of the big Biden bill, as the anonymous attendee put it, that's how I see that one. I'm going to jump to another one from Amy Rossman. And Danielle, this one's for you. What happened to the bill that would prohibit killing beavers on public land?
Yeah, and actually, as I was seeing that, I'm like, I need to pull up OLIS and double check where that is. So just for everybody else's reference, there's also a bill to prohibit trapping of beaver on all federally managed public lands. And the last I heard, that still didn't have a public hearing, but I need to double check that. So Amy, let me, while Sean's maybe answering the next one, I'll just look it up on OLIS. Because again, as you can tell, these things are changing quite rapidly.
Great, thanks, Danielle. We had another one from Stephen Fuller Rowell. Can you provide a link to a list of how senators voted recently on the confirmation of the governor's slate of the 3 new appointments to the Board of Forestry? So I mentioned the Board of Forestry, 7-member body. The governor nominates candidates to serve on that board, and then the Senate has to confirm them. And that's been a process over the last year plus, and not just for the Board of Forestry, but also for the Fish and Wildlife Commission. It's very difficult to get people through this Senate gauntlet of confirmation. And finally, after a few false starts, the governor put forward a slate of 3 folks. Generally a slate that was supported by Oregon Wild and some of our allies, and they were voted and confirmed. Gosh, I think it was last month. Maybe it was the beginning of this month. Time is a flat circle. So as far as the information on the vote, when I looked after that vote happened, I didn't see the specifics. Part of the reason is that they usually put these forward as a big slate. And so there were 100 nominations to various boards and commissions, and the Board of Forestry nominees were part of that. And the big slate goes through usually unanimously or only with a few votes of opposition. I did watch the Senate chamber when they voted on this, and they singled out one candidate. It's a colleague of ours. Her name is Chandra Ferrari. She works at Trout Unlimited and is going to be a powerful conservation voice on the board. She was singled out to be voted on separately by the Republicans, and all Republicans voted against her that were in attendance. Brian Boquist, who is now an independent, but also, gosh, borderline certifiable, he voted for her, and so she did have the independent vote as well. But she went through as well. But that's a long answer for. I don't think I can send you a link because I don't think they broke it down on the state's legislative information site. All right, let's see. We got a few more here. Dana Greenblatt, Danielle, this one's for you. And we can try to tag team it if you don't know the answer. What is meant by 100% clean energy sold?
Yeah, I think I know that one. So the fact of the matter is there's actually, I think often almost an overgeneration. And so why they put in the word sold is that it's actually what is being passed to the ratepayers, what's actually being used in Oregon. So there's different projects that are constantly in development, but they want to ensure that that's actually what's been selected, what's actually being sold to the customers, so that they can say that the origins of their energy is clean. It's not just because it all goes into the grid, and there's lots of different projects. So I think that's how they have to clarify that this is actually energy that is going to ratepayers. That's why it's got to say the sold on it. I don't know if you have a different analysis. That's my.
No, that's great. And on the Beaver bill, we have a follow-up question, and maybe you've been able to get more information on that. David Harrison says, my understanding is that HB 2843, which would close federal lands to beaver trapping and hunting, is being held up in committee by Representative Witt.
That probably isn't surprising. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably right. I think the private land bill is, like I said, it's getting a hearing tomorrow. So my guess is he wanted to see probably what happens with that and then go. But Witt has not been, Witt actually testified in front of the Fish and Wildlife Commission. So that bill, sorry, this is a little complicated. That bill actually, it was originated as a petition in front of the Fish and Wildlife Commission. The Fish and Wildlife Commission decided to create a working group, which I'm actually going to be on, to talk about beaver management on public lands. Representative Witt actually did testify at that petition hearing against that petition. So it's probably not gonna look good for that bill given his opposition to it. There was an attempt, I think, to get that bill through a different committee, like the Water Committee, which wildlife, we try to do this a lot. We try to get this to other committees depending on the chair and how we think it'll go, but we'll see. There's still time, but my guess is he wants to see what happens on the private land bill, and yeah, he's just not a big fan.
Thanks, Danielle. So we have one more question here in the queue, which is maybe a good transition into this resources page that we have up. The question is from an anonymous attendee. My representative and senator are both conservative Republicans. Any thoughts on whether it's worth it to contact them or just lay low right now? So I think hopefully everyone can still see the screen, and there's a few resources here. So I'll start off by saying it is worth it, depending, and I'll maybe get into that a little bit. First of all, you never know what issue a particular legislator is going to be sympathetic to. Danielle mentioned with the coyote killing contest, it was used as a cudgel in the urban-rural divide fight and was part of the walkout, but it actually had Republican support then, and it has Republican support now. And so you got to find allies wherever you can get them. And some Democrats are bad on these issues that we're talking about today, and some Republicans can sometimes be good on them. So I think it's always worth, as a constituent, letting your elected representative know where you're at on an issue, they think they might represent a monolith, but they do not. There's a diversity of opinion in their district. I think it's hugely important. So
can I just add one example to that?
Yeah, of course.
So there was a bill that we helped pass to ban the use of these M44 cyanide devices that often were littered on the landscape, and they were indiscriminate and they killed dogs. And anyway, it was awful. Luckily, we got them banned in Oregon. But Sherry Springer, Republican, she agreed that they were heinous, but she definitely was like, you know what? I got lots of calls from my constituents, and I'm voting with how my constituents are asking me to vote. So you just really never know where people are going to fall. So yeah, I think it's worth it.
Yeah, and so as far as if you are looking to do that, well, one thing Danielle asked, while I'm saying this, maybe you can make sure you pop into the question answer box for folks to see a link to a Wild Ones presentation. This is our activist training team, and Danielle is going to be doing a training next week that will help people get sort of deeper into the process of weighing in on legislation. So if you're interested in getting more information on that, definitely sign up. Here's a little bit of a cursory 101 on this. We have the legislative website up here. This is OLIS. It's the Oregon Legislative Information System, and it has all of the information on the legislation that's up for consideration. It has it sorted by committee. You can search by keyword. There's all sorts of ways that you can engage with what's being proposed and know the schedule. And we'll show you that in a second. The other link I have here is that if you don't know who your legislators are, there's a really easy tool where you can search by address. And it's located on the main Oregon Legislature site, oregonlegislature.gov. You can actually see it on the homepage. But if you find your legislator section and put in your address, you'll get to know who your state representative, state senator is, and also who your federal representative is. And that's just great, because it's always we really want to demystify the idea that these people can't be influenced or that they're somehow on a pedestal. They are average people who listen to constituents. It's their job to hear from constituents. Some are grumpier than others. Some are super friendly. But you don't know until you try, and you might find that you have a really influential voice to weigh in on these things. And in OLIS, this image at the bottom, this is actually what it looks like when you're in it, and you can subscribe to follow bills. You can subscribe by email to any committee or any bill that you get automatic emailed updates to you, so that you don't have to be in there every day after work looking and scrounging around. And I figured it'd be helpful to show everyone in the last couple minutes that we have. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen there and share a new one to show you how we navigate around in here. Danielle, can you see that? Great. So this is the Oregon Legislative Information System, OLIS, and you can see that if you go there on any day, you get today's information, and you can see what's happening, which meetings are happening today, what time. There's recordings of them, so you can, if you couldn't make one, you can watch the testimony, see what the legislators were saying about it, see who testified. You can also search by bills, and you can search by bill number, by bill text, and by bill sponsor, and then committee. And you can see we've been talking a lot about the House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee. So if we go here, we get the committee's page. We get to see who the committee members are. And so if you have a representative that's on a committee of relevance for a bill you care about, definitely reach out to them. That's the first step, is to get bills out of committee. And so if it's a chair or anyone on the committee, it's worth talking with them. And then you can see the schedule. Past meetings are recorded. And one of the things that we wanted to show you, let's say, this hearing tomorrow that has some of the bills that Danielle mentioned, you can see the bills listed. You can see the live stream of the meeting if you want to watch it. But here's the important part about how to weigh in. You can go down here and you could submit written testimony, or you can register to testify through the remote software. And I'll just click on this electronic testimony, written testimony, just so you can see how it works. You've got the committee that pops up there already because I came from the committee page. And then if you select the date that you're interested in, it's going to show you the bills that are being considered. So here's the Beaver bill. And so we're going to select that one, and then we can put in our information. We can say that we support the bill, and we can either write text right into a field, or we can upload a PDF. So it's actually pretty easy to weigh in if you want to do that through written testimony, or go through a similar process to sign up and testify remotely, just like you're on a Zoom meeting. So I'm going to stop that there, but we just really do encourage people to get involved, and we don't want this to feel, but we never want the legislature to feel like it's this place on a hill that average people can't influence. But we are at an hour, and we don't have any other questions left in the question box. Oh, it's a comment. I checked it out. Yeah. We got someone telling us they got to go to another meeting, which I think we all have to go to another meeting because we're at an hour. And we're really appreciative that you joined today. And remember that you can rewatch this on the Oregon Wild blog if you so choose. And thanks so much for your support. Remember, the raffle will be, we'll let you know tomorrow about that. But otherwise, have a great St. Patrick's Day and nearly spring. And we'll see you at a future webcast. Thanks, Danielle.